Welcome back to the program. We are joined here by Professor Paul Robinson to discuss Russia's world order, which also happens to be the title of his most recent book, which I will leave a link to the book in the description. So, thank you for coming on. This is it's a fascinating topic, that of Russia's world order, how it views, I guess, the role of civilization in the new organization of the international system. It seems that um, the civilizational discourse in Russia, it seems to reject this whole notion that Russia should just be a state within or even orbiting the Western-led liberal order. Instead, we see this rhetoric that it's a civilizational state of its own, with its own values, its own identity, and its own path in the world. So I was wondering if you can unpack some of these ideas around what you see in the Russian world order.
Yes, well, first of all, Glenn, thank you for inviting me. As you say, this is a product of my latest book called Russia's World Order, How Civilizationism Explains the Conflict with the West. So in this, I look at this theory of civilizationism. So if you can imagine this as a competition between two different views of progress and of history, and the prevailing Western world is, you might say, a sort of Francis Fukuyama style idea of a unilinear trajectory of history in which everybody goes in the same direction and ends up in the same place, which is normally associated, of course, with Western institutions and values. So we, the West, are the most progressive, most advanced model, which everybody else is bound sooner or later to emulate. Civilizationism rejects this idea and says that, in essence, there's not one civilization. There isn't civilization singular. There is a multiplicity of different civilizations. And that history consists of all these different civilizations progressing along their own paths to their own destinations. And this discourse was been around in Russia for 150 years or so, but it's only really in the last decade that senior Russian politicians, including the president, and some of those around him, have begun to use this language and use it increasingly. And it's found its way into state policy documents. It's found itself in high school and university curricula. And I think it's clearly related to external events, in that the multi-civilizational concept of the world fits with the idea of a multipolar world which is not dominated by one particular bloc, in other words, the West. So in essence, in order to try and deny Western hegemony, you challenge the idea that Western institutions and values are universally valid, and that the Western model is one which everybody else must emulate. And instead, you propose a view of history which suggests that states can move in their own directions and are therefore entitled to reject Western hegemony and Western institutions, and follow their own path. And this reflects the idea that Russia believes in or at least, has an interest, you might say, in a multipolar order in which institutions globally are not dominated entirely by Western powers.
Well, you write in the book that radical states, they tend to look at the world as it should be. And well, I guess it's a assumption behind the universalist idea. If you assume that the world and society should progress on a set path, then you define then radicals as concluding that anything that obstructs this path ought to be removed. And is this well? It sounds a bit like as you said, the post-Cold War liberal international order, where what doesn't fit within this path has to be cast aside. Is this the source of the discontent in Russia regarding Western universalism, or why is it such a strong resentment towards this universalist idea.
Well, I think in part it is. There's really, I think, various models of the universalist concept. They would all agree that we're all heading in the same direction, but what you might say a conservative version of it would say, yes, we're all moving in the same direction. We'll all end up in the same place, but we start in different locations, and therefore we should all find our own different ways of getting there. And you shouldn't try and force the pace, because that will be, cause backlash and be potentially dangerous. So that would be the sort of conservative version of this. The more radical version of this translates and into an ought, because we are essentially all the same. We ought all to be the same and as rapidly as possible. And in the Russian case, this sort of more radical universalism has been associated with highly disruptive revolutionary events, notably, of course, the communist revolution, because communism was this sort of radical universalism on steroids. And then, of course, the 1990s, when the radical utopianism of communism was replaced by radical utopianism of Western free market liberalism. And Russians sort of became disenchanted with both. They first became disenchanted with the utopian model of communism, and then the experience of the 1990s turned them off the radical free market version. And therefore, this more radical universalism suggests that not only we're going the same direction, but we must speed it up, and Russia must follow now, full hog, right, or even take the lead, has been largely discredited in Russia. And already from the mid-1990s, you've got quite a few Russian intellectuals who were looking for alternative models of historical progress. And that's when you get all these thinkers beginning to emerge of essentially modern Eurasianism and things like this, which for a long time, I think, were very much in the intellectual background. They reflected a more general societal discontent with the universal models, but they themselves were not accepted by those in authority. It's only more recent years that the people in authority have begun to take these models and use them for themselves.
But this idea about the intellectual debates about what Russia is in terms of civilization, much of this goes back to the 19th century, though. Is Russia, does development mean that Russia should become more European along thinking of Peter the Great, or is Russia a unique actor or a unique entity which can only contribute to the world by walking in its own path, essentially? Is this more or less the same ideas which have revived now?
More or less. So, I mean, you can trace this back at these two debates between Westernizers and Slavophiles in the mid 19th century. Although there was a slight distinction there in that even Slavophiles back in the 19th century tended to believe in universal progress. They just didn't associate it with the West. And they thought that the world as a whole was moving in the same direction. Just that direction was not going to be the Western model, because the Western model, they felt, had reached its end with Hegel. Really beyond Hegel, they felt that the West had nothing to offer. That had become one-sided, materialistic, individualistic, a-religious, and lost its spiritual moorings. Whereas Russia had kept its spiritual moorings and could bring this back to the West, and then Russia and the West would eventually follow the same path, but it would be a new path, right? It's only sometimes later with people like Danilevsky and Leontiev in the 1870s that you get this idea that no, we're the West and Russia do not follow the same path at all. It's not about us contributing to the universal good, because there is no universal good. There's just individual civilizational goods. And it's really then that you get this sort of highly distinct civilizational thinking coming into play. As for today, it's not always very clear what Russian thinkers and Russian politicians think when they're talking about these things, because on the one hand, they there is any sort of universal good and a universal civilization. On the other hand, they do sometimes talk about civilization in the singular. So civilizationism, like all ideologies, is one with certain contradictions in it, I think.
But there's a lot of civilizational scholars who have looked at, well, essentially envisioned civilizations going through this cycle of, well, some called spring, summer, autumn, and then winter, and well, the assumption is that civilizations essentially exhaust themselves. The material can exhaust the spiritual, or civilization might outgrow its own cultural roots, and yeah, like a plant, it would die. Is this in terms of the relationship with the West, or how do you see this? Is this the Russian cultural conservatism and spirit or spiritual tradition versus the decadence of the West, or do you see the civilizational discourse being more decoupled or independent from the West, or does it still see itself in the mirror image?
That's a difficult question, because I think there's civilizationists are conflicted on this about whether they're entirely decoupled. Some would clearly like Russia to be entirely decoupled, but some I think are not so sure that it's possible. So if you take a slightly extreme example, which would be Alexander Dugin, he clearly would like Russia to be decoupled, but at the same time, it's fairly obvious that he doesn't think it is, right? But he thinks Russia's problem is that it isn't decoupled, and but it ought to be, and that until it decouples itself, it will never be able to have a stable future. You see this also in some isolationist, civilizationist thinkers who say that as long as Russia tries to gain the West's recognition, and there are many historians who would say that Russian foreign policy has been largely over the years about gaining recognition from the West, gaining status in the eyes of the West, trying to gain a recognition of equality in the eyes of the West. And the isolationists say, well, as long as you do this, you're going to have trouble, because you're never going to get that recognition, and you're just going to have competition and conflict. You need to completely cut yourself off from the West and go your own way. And that's for the good of both. I think it was Tsimbirsky who said, Russia and the West are like two porcupines who, to live in comfort, need to be one needle's length away from one needle's length away from each other. So there is that point of view that ideally we should be separate, but at the same time, it's not very obvious in their minds that Russia is. And when you look at what they try and say about how Russia is different, they actually have real problems coming up with good arguments about how Russia is distinct, because many of the arguments they come up with are not very convincing. I think there's quite a lot of, it's more about trying to construct an image of how we're different, while recognizing that in practice, perhaps we're not so much.
That's one of the, I guess, internal contradictions, though, of the conservatism in Russia. That is, if you want to preserve your own history and traditions, and see this as a unique path for Russia, then they also have to recognize that a lot of its history has been very closely intertwined with Europe. That is, it is, from Peter the Great to Yeltsin, they also have this European Russia, which, again, same as the Soviet Russian. If they want to be conservative, they do have to also incorporate this, I guess, radical movements which sought to remake Russia. But you have a chapter, though, on state power and ideological messaging, and I find the relationship between power and ideology is always interesting. I mean, in the West, the liberal democracy is genuinely upheld as a value or ideology which the leadership believes in. However, we also see that ideologies are used instrumentally. So in the West, we refer to liberal hegemony if we want to assert hegemony, legitimized use of force. But how do you see the Russian state using ideology, though, to, I guess, assert authority at home and push its power abroad?
That's a good question again. I think fundamentally the Russian state in its current manifestation is not deeply ideological. In fact, I think it's to some degree almost anti-ideological. The Russian constitution actually prohibits there being a state ideology. And there was an interesting a report brought out recently by Sergei Karaganov and others, who are sometimes seen as being sort of Kremlin sponsors ideologues, in which they were talking about the need for a state ideology. And it was actually subtly critical of Putin and the state for not accepting that there should be a state ideology. But that doesn't mean that the Russian state is entirely unideological, because it's not possible for any institution, any state to operate without some set of underlying principles. And I think the ideological discourse has become clearer over the years. Though to what extent it's reflective of a genuine change of heart among those in authority, or to what extent it is a product of a recognition that this is instrumentally useful, is not clear. Perhaps it's a combination of both. But as I see it, ideology is not really a motivation for action. So the Russian state isn't doing things because its ideology tells it to do them. Rather, ideology is a framework which is used to justify actions in front of domestic audiences and as well as foreign audiences. So the decisions the Russian state makes are, for the most part, made for what one in international relations theory would call realist reasons, fairly interest-based reasons. But they are framed increasingly in some degree of ideological packaging. So the current conflict with the West is not ideological at heart. It's based on differing perceptions of interest and security. That said, it has taken on an ideological dimension because the Russian state needs to justify this, right? In reasons other than just cold, pure power politics. So for its civilizational discourse, this idea that the world is not all just progressing in the Western direction is increasingly allied to anti-colonial rhetoric, and with references to the Soviet Union as the with Russia, modern Russia as the successor to the Soviet Union, and as thus the heir to the anti-colonial movement. And then this is then broadcast to African audiences with some success, and Russia is sort of speaking to African population and African leaders and saying, look, the West are colonialists. They want everyone to be like them. They want to force you to follow their lead. They are these radical universalists who don't allow for independent development, whereas we, Russia, have always supported anti-colonialism. We support a multi-civilizational order. We therefore support your right to do your thing in the way that you want. And you can see how this is a politically useful tool in winning hearts and minds in global South and avoiding Russia's complete global isolation.
You mentioned Karaganov, and he did an interesting interview already. I remember back in 2016 for the German magazine Der Spiegel, where he made this point that as you suggested earlier, that we already learned everything we could from the West. There's nothing more there to get. Indeed, the Europe we liked, it ceased existing in the 50s and 60s. That's what we wanted to join. We do not care for this new Europe, and essentially framing the West as being spiritually weak and hollowed out. So I think the title of the interview, "We Are Stronger and We're Better and We'll Win," something along those lines.
Yeah. That's actually quite a common theme among conservative Russians. They would say we're not anti-European, we're anti-what, or anti-Western, we're anti what the West has become. Yeah. That the West is no longer the West. That Europe was a Christian society. It upheld family values. It upheld the nation. It was patriotic. It was some degree hierarchical. It was liberal, right? But it has ceased to be all those things. It has become, the illiberal area of cancel culture. It has become the area of LGBT rights and so on and so forth. And we don't want these things. And therefore we want the old Europe. We don't want the new Europe. And some of them would actually say, to go back what you were saying about Russian conservatives have to reckon with their European past. I think they would say, well, we are the true Europeans in this respect. European civilization has died. So you talk about life cycles of civilization. European civilization has either died or is in the process of dying.
Yeah, that's the contradiction I meant, because sometimes in the tensions with the West, sometimes, well, throughout history, sometimes Russia has presented itself as the real Europe. This is, again, something that's repeated itself. At the same time, it also represents itself as something different in Europe. But this is what I meant. There's some more of a expression almost of contempt of the Europe, essentially, abandoning its own values. That is being not just excessively materialist, culturally and spiritually decadent. And the culture wars, of course, have become a punchline, it seems, across the Russian media space at least. But as you said, this is a theme which you hear also among the political leadership, that the Europeans have rejected their own culture, they rejected their own faith, the family structure, the nation. Again, what should be most the most sacred for conservatives. So it's seen as, again, a civilization which has rejected its own culture and roots, which will therefore predictably die. Do you see
Yes.
then? Um, do you see essentially this being the warning or the warning sign of what Russia should avoid, like what should fuel its, I guess, cultural revival to avoid falling into the Western trap? Or I'm just trying to get my hands on
Well,
what.
that's certainly, I think, how many Russian civilizationists would view it. I mean, of course, they've been talking of the decline of the West for 150 years. Even back in, I think there was some guy called Shigarov, I think it was back in the 1840s, who said, you can smell the stench of death coming from Europe. So this collapse of Western civilization has been predicted for a very, very long time, but it is a common theme, and it's quite commonly expressed now that the West has, as you said, abandoned its own civilization and is doomed. And that if Russia is to survive, it must follow a different path. This was something, of course, laid out by Leontief back in the 1870s, who said, Western civilizations have a natural lifespan of 1,000 years, and Western civilization is nearing its end. So Russia has a choice. It can either join Europe and go down with it, or it can embrace something completely different and found a new civilization. So this then creates a problem, because if your idea that civilizations rise and fall, if you're saying Russia is a distinct civilization, then it's probably also fairly old one too, and therefore it might also be near its death. So the idea I think many of them would have would be, well, we need to build a new civilization. So in essence, rise up again, right? But then they have difficulties discerning exactly, what that would be.
But the focus on this multipolar vision of the world as part of the Russian world order, do you see this as being rooted in the need to accommodate Russia as a great power, or is it more about accommodating Russia as a distinctive civilization, that is one that shouldn't have to follow others, or do they go hand in hand?
They, some degree, go hand in hand. So on the one hand, Russian leaders do not want to be dictated to on internal affairs, right? So civilizationism, saying you're distinct civilization, provides you with a justification of why you do not, for instance, embrace certain, modern Western norms, such as I think one of the sort of key ones of this tends to be LGBT rights, which really do get stressed a lot in this discourse. They'll say, well, you do that, but we're not doing that. So then you have to justify why you can be different. Okay. And also why you are allegedly, not living up to Western standards of liberal democracy. Right. So why you have a highly centralized political system in which a vast amount of power is concentrated in the hands of the president, for instance, right? How do you justify that? Where you say, well, we're different, our society is different, our history has shown that we need this particular format of government, or the society descends into chaos. That doesn't mean that you need it, but we need it, and therefore you can't tell us what to do, right? So, and if you wrap it up in civilizational discourse, it's different civilizations have a right to different development, and that justifies you resisting attacks or resisting accusations that you're failing to live up to universal norms, and you ought to, and but these universal norms are associated with the West. So it serves that purpose in terms of justifying domestic political direction. It also, of course, as I said, justifies resistance on the international level against what is seen as Western abuse of the international order. So the complaint here would be that the West, that you have all these institutions, World Trade Organization, IMF, World Bank, United Nations, so on and so forth, which are notionally belong to everybody, but in practice tend to be dominated by one part of the world, which then tends to bend their rules whenever it suits them. And it talks about a rules-based order, whereas in fact, those rules are continually bent or interpreted in a way which favors one part of the world. And this causes, some resentment, or at least this understanding of what is going on, whether it is going on or not is a matter of debate, but this understanding that this is what is going on causes resentment in Russia and leads to demands that, no, we need to have global institutions in which power is more equitably divided, and in which one part of the world is not able to dictate the rules to everybody else and change the rules, on a whim whenever it suits it. This is why you press for a multipolar order, because in a multipolar order, theoretically, you will have a greater say, and you'll be less likely to be pushed around by one part of the world. And civilizationism is again, it's just a philosophical means of justifying this political position, which is taken for largely interest reasons.
Well, under the Soviet Union, the Soviets had a universalist idea around Marxism. But what's interesting then was under this Marxist idea, this was used to mobilize, I guess, global opposition to the West. That is, anti-colonial, anti-hegemonic, and having more equitable world. Now, what is interesting under this new world order, it's very different in a way that it's Russia's become, is this a Christian traditional civilization, um, having distinctive values. So again, very different from the universalisms of the past. However, it's still in its engagement with the East, that is China, as well as the global South. Russia still carries on this as a push to reject Western universalism.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost as, this distinctive civilizational or powers of the world unite against this hegemonic West, because it still functions, so doesn't it, as a counter-hegemonic coalition, as it now puts itself in the same camp as the global South.
It's a counter-hegemonic coalition with the same people as before, by and large, but on a different basis. So in the Cold War can be seen as a competition between two universalisms: the universalism of communism and the universalism of capitalism on the other side. Now it's between the one universalism, the West, and then an anti-universalism on the other side. So it's a competition between those who believe in universal history and those who reject universal history. So in that sense, although the coalition perhaps has remained the same, the intellectual basis of it has significantly changed, and that's possibly a intellectual shift which we in the West don't fully understand or haven't woken up to. There's still a tendency here to speak of the competition between East and West as between democracy and autocracy, as if there's like one model and then there's this other model, autocracy, which somebody else is pushing. Whereas in fact, the civilizationists are not pushing any model. They reject any model. And they would say, well, you could be autocratic if you like, or you can be not autocratic if you like. It's up to you. We're not picking one or the other. So we're I think misinterpreting here what the competition is. We're imagining that it's a rejection entirely of democracy, liberalism, and so on. But civilizationists actually don't say that. They or at least not all of them say that. Many of them say, well, look, if you want to be liberal democratic, be liberal democratic. If country X in Africa or Latin America wants to be liberal democratic, that's fine. But if it doesn't, that's fine too. So therefore, it's a different competition which we haven't fully woken up to, I think, and to which we're perhaps ill-prepared intellectually to deal with.
Yeah, no, I often thought about this as well, that this is a massive weakness because, again, after the Cold War, because we maintained, for example, the dividing lines in Europe, we recast ideological divisions as well. Instead of having communism versus capitalism, we recast it as, well, liberal democracies versus autocracies. And this is kind of the new divisions. And it's I can see why this is an appealing or an attractive way to look at the world, because then who favors autocracies over liberal democracies? We make ourselves into the good guy. It's a very nice way of framing world conflicts, and it's a good way of organizing unity whenever we have any tensions with Russia. It's do you stand up for our good values or do you stand up for autocracy? But as you suggest, we might delude ourselves, because this is not what they are actually pushing. It's a rejection of universalism. And even this applies to China, I think, to some extent, because often people assume that it's a universalist ideals of America versus some, perhaps Marxist views of the Chinese. But the Chinese, they very much speak in the same language now as the Russians. That is, every civilization have their own path to development. Each civilization should be a separate flower on a meadow. And, if they're all the same, it's almost like having absence of biological diversity. It will make the world poorer. So it's, I think, ignoring this this rejection of universalism. I think, we could end up fooling ourselves, though.
I think we are to some degree. There's this idea that somehow there's this alliance of autocracies that the Chinese and the Russians and others are allied together almost because they're autocracy and they believe in autocracy, and they want to undermine Western liberal democracy from within and spread autocratic ideas elsewhere, rather like the communists did. But actually, there's no indication that I've seen of it they're interested in that, or that they even care about that, or that is in any way at the heart of their dispute with the West, right? And yes, as you say, it makes us look the good guys if we express the conflict in this way, but by doing so, we misread it, and that of course leads us into error, I believe, and we could pay a heavy price for that in the end of the day. And as you say, this civilizational discourse is being used elsewhere. The Indians are using it, the Chinese are using it. It's become quite common, which is, of course, is one reason perhaps why the Russians also have started using it, because they've seen that this is a discourse which has appeal, right? But by using this language, they can actually win the hearts and minds of the global South, whereas the West, with its preaching about universal values, tends to fall on barren ground, because in former colonial states, in states which are, former European colonies, being told that, the West is the center of civilization tends not to go down very well. And they say, well, hang on, you guys who conquered us and enslaved us and all the rest of us, how can you preach to us about, universal Western values and tell us that we have to be like you? Whereas the civilizational discourse perhaps falls on more fertile ground, and therefore is more likely to win over that part of the world. And by failing to acknowledge what the intellectual debate really is, we will lose it from, before it even starts, really.
Well, that's the thing. No matter how good or profound the universal values are, it also has that pragmatic function, though. That is, if we say liberal democratic values are universal and we are the champions of it, the leaders, the whole world has to be remade almost in our image. And it can also mean that other world countries become second rate. If you have a rivalry between, for example, over Ukraine, then if Russians would accept this idea of liberal democratic universalism, then why would, for example, Ukraine lean towards Russia when the Western countries are more liberal democratic? Essentially, well, it seems to translate into a system of sovereign inequality as well, where obviously if it's one path to development and we're more advanced, then it's our job to put the rest of the world on the right track.
Yeah,
but on
absolutely, it favors our own. One reason, of course, it's such a popular discourse here is it favors our own hegemony, and allows us to dictate to others. But I think it's deeply hardwired in the Western mentality. It is the prevailing, almost universally accepted discourse in the political and intellectual class. There, of course, will be a few exceptions, but for instance, here in Canada, where I live, I mean, it's 99.9% of the political class view the world in that way, and as you say, it is potentially dangerous, because even if you are correct about the superiority of Western institutions and values, and even if you're correct about how it'd be beneficial for others to adopt them, trying to force the pace on it in the face of opposition is liable to cause conflict, right? And if you insist that other states must separate themselves from the orbit of large powers who are not Western liberal democratic, then you're creating a security threat to those other powers, which is liable to cause them to push back at you. So even if from an intellectual, philosophical position you're correct, from a pure power politics perspective, you're playing a very dangerous game.
Yeah, I noticed that, well, one of the risks would be that even if you think there's only one path to development, that it can manifest itself in very destructive policies. So, for example, I asked once in a debate if now that in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, now that we know how this played out, if we should do it all again, would we still support the toppling of Yanukovych back in 2014 if we know that it would lead to war, which would lead to the complete destruction of Ukraine and all these deaths, all this loss of territory?
I think we would.
Yeah, but that's what they say. They say, well, it's better that they at least start on this path towards becoming going towards the Western orbit. So essentially, all this death, destruction is like, yeah, well, it's kind of worth it because they have to go this way sooner or later, because history can only go one direction, which kind of makes one a little bit concerned, because why would you accept the principle of compromise and concessions and harmonizing security interests if you do think that the only way perpetual peace can manifest itself is by going down this path? And if there's a war, then that's just the war that history demands of us on this path to the same universal development.
Yes, I mean, this of course is reflective of the more sort of radical universalism I talked about at the beginning. I mentioned that there is a more conservative version of universalism which would say, well, yes, we're all going in the same direction, but you can go there in different ways, and you should move there slowly and cautiously. And that was an option which, of course, was open to us and still is open to us. But we don't seem to be willing to accept it. And in fact, there's also there's a rather vicious cycle here. The more, by pursuing when you pursue the radical method of pushing history along, you get pushback. But then the pushback you get intellectually justifies your radical method, because you say, look, they really are bad. Yes. So therefore, we are right to push it. Yeah. You therefore end up getting even more radicalized. And you can sort of see this, for instance, in Georgia, where the Georgian government doesn't actually reject this Europeanization, Westernization concept in theory, and it says it wants to join EU and NATO and all the rest of it. But because it says, well, we don't want to have another war with Russia, so we're gonna take this very carefully, okay? And we don't want to be sucked into a conflict which we think the EU is pushing us. They then get, attacked, and efforts are made to really essentially to overthrow them for not being radical enough, for being conservative universalists rather than radical ones. And this conservative universalism is simply intellectually rejected, as far as I can see, in the channel, in the corridors of power, because then that requires accommodation, requires acceptance of power politics, and therefore is seen as sort of morally compromised, and so on and so forth. So I think that's somewhat regrettable, but it's where we are.
Yeah, well, it's not just the Russian factor. The Georgians are also quite adamant that they have their own, very long traditions and history and culture, which makes them unique. And they don't like the idea of liberal democracy being a new form of Marxism, so essentially something that transcends history. And I think, it's not that unique to the Georgians, and I think you even find these elements within the West. So Hungary, for example, saying, well, all this universalism, you can't wash over, the tradition and religious history of our country. My last question is just about the Ukraine war then, because we see, well, that it appears that, of course, well, I think it did, but the mere power considerations is what probably triggered this war, in terms of Russia couldn't live with, NATO incursion into Ukraine, all of this. But still, one sees some civilizational rhetoric in terms of, especially after the invasion and as the war has progressed. And I thought it was interesting because we had some references to civilization also in the West. I remember around 2013-14, when there were efforts to make Ukraine choose between the West or Russia. You had statements from political leaders that Ukraine didn't just have to choose a bloc, it had to make a civilizational choice. This was repeated. And now you see more references to civilization from the Russians as well. But to what extent do you see this world order and civilization in the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think that's actually key, because if you study sort of Eastern European, post-Soviet, in post-Soviet societies, the intellectual viewpoint of liberal intellectuals, it is very much about returning to civilization, as they would call it back in the 1980s and 1990s, that there is civilization, which is Western Europe. And because of communism, we have somehow been cast out of civilization, and we must return to civilization. And this is the dream of liberal intellectuals, to return to civilization, to be what they would call a normal country, right? Which means essentially a Western European country. And one can understand this aspiration, because, looking from the late Soviet Union at Western Europe, one can see the obviously attractions in a multiplicity of different ways. As someone who was a student of the Soviet Union, I'm convinced in this way of the superiority of the Western model, and why you would want to emulate it. But of course, once you start looking that way, then there has to be a not civilization. If you're returning to civilization, there's a not civilization, and the not civilization is Russia. So therefore, the overthrow of Yanukovych and the subsequent political direction taken by Ukraine is fully framed and both about returning to civilization, which means being part of Europe, being part of the EU, being part of NATO, which are, going to use academic jargon, they're ontological objectives, and that they are wrapped up with whole ideas of entity and essence of your meaning and being, right? This is it really means something crucially, vitally important to them, but they be recognized as being part of this Western community. Okay, this is the ultimate dream, right? But it does require a thoroughgoing, utter rejection of the other, of the non-civilization, which means that it is inevitably perceived by the other as a threat. Now, maybe they're wrong in viewing it that way, but it necessarily wraps it all up in this civilizational rhetoric of there is civilization of the West, which is good. There is non-civilization. There's barbarism. So in traditional anthropological theories of development, you go from savagery to barbarism to civilization. It's like a three-stage process. Russia is barbarism. Okay, and you can see this in all the rhetoric which is so common in the Western press and from Western politicians. And this is almost the necessary framing of this. So in that sense, it's quite interesting that although it's the Russians who are using the civilizational rhetoric to justify their conception of the world order, while the West is claiming a sort of universal view of history. At the same time, this civilizational language is also being used by people in the West, but of course with a slightly different meaning. Rather than accepting multiple civilizations, they think there is civilization. Okay, this, of course, inevitably causes conflict with those who are being rejected. Now, that doesn't justify, of course, an extremely violent response to that rejection, but it perhaps helps cause it in some way.
Yeah. No, well, that's what I meant. I've seen not just commentators in the West, but also state leaders making essentially looking to denigrate the Russian culture as a way almost of advancing the logic or the arguments for continuing the war. But then on the other side, on the Russian, you also see this when they've seized some villages or towns. It's not just the Russian flag though that goes up. In the beginning, you saw a lot of Soviet flags because to show the civilizational or historical connection with these lands. But more recently, you see more of the flags with Christ on it, and something going into the Orthodox Church, and so again they're well, again, you have, when you're coming into these territories, which used to be Ukrainian, you have to show why they are actually part of you and not that other, the decadence of the banderas or the West. That this is essentially the Russian world coming back again. So it's quite fascinating to see that this even plays out on the battlefield, I guess.
Yes, but symbology is strange. I once saw a video of like some village the Russians had captured, and on the same building at one end there was a Soviet flag, on the other end there was a Russian imperial flag on the same building, right? Well, I guess it makes sense to them.
Well, it's as you know, I wrote a book on, just like you, on Russian conservatism, and if you want to build conservatives, build on the past, that is the stability of the present, rest on the anchoring in the past. And when you country like Russia, which is such a revolutionary history though, where they go from one extreme to the other, you all have to incorporate all these factions into one national narrative. And I think at that point it can be confusing to look at the Soviet flag next to some flags of the Orthodox Church and Christ, and then some Russian imperial flags. But again, this is kind of what conservatism translates into in Russia, which is fascinating, though.
And it's a rejection also then of the Western liberal approach, which you're seeing, which involves decommunization and a complete negation, essentially, of the symbols of the past, on the theory that the mentality of the past is what holds you back from developing the future. So it was very different. You can see this being played out in Ukraine, the conservative model of Russia, which says you've got to somehow integrate all the bits of your past, the imperial, the Soviet, the post-Soviet, and put them all into one, because that's what you are. And the post-Maidan model of Ukraine, which says no, you've got to decommunize and start essentially from scratch. So two different models of development really being playing out on the battlefield in that sense.
Well, as I said, a fascinating book. So please go look in the description and order a copy.
If I can allow a plug, I just have it here.
Russia's World Order. Apple. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. And
well, thank you, Glenn. It's been an interesting conversation.